Hello and welcome to Bible 309, the coronavirus online version. This is new territory for all of us. And so what I've decided to do, since we already have done probably about 2/3 of our work is already remote learning, as it's technically called. We have online quizzes, we have online blog posts and that sort of a thing. All I really need to do is move the lectures online, and then we'll be set. So that's what this video is an attempt to do. I want to keep these videos relatively short. I usually have a timer to kind of keep me under 15 minutes. You'll notice that they're all hosted on YouTube. And they're in a playlist, so you can subscribe to the playlist if you'd like, and then as I update it, I think you'll get notifications, or just go into that playlist and see what's new. If you have comments, I feel like a YouTuber all of a sudden. Go ahead and put a comment and subscribe to this channel. But they're all private, so they're unlisted, I should say, so only people who have the invite can see them, so that's basically our class. So please do listen to the lectures. I'm going to pick up where we left off in the Revelation chapter 4 and 5. So if you have any questions as the rest of the semester progresses, please feel free to shoot me an email. We will stick to the schedule as much as possible with respect to quizzes and blog posts. I noticed that most of you are still doing the blog posts, and I haven't checked the quizzes lately, but I'll do that soon. I will be adding to the quizzes also, hopefully this week. I'm on a 14-day self what do you call it, quarantine, because I was in Turkey. I'm not allowed to go back to my office. So I actually need to get somebody to go pick up my ESV study Bible for me so I can continue writing those quizzes. But I'll have the rest of the quizzes up hopefully by the end of the week. So let's talk about Revelation 4 and 5. I've titled this section The Worship of the Lamb, and in your notes that's page 178. Usually these two chapters are used for their description of heavenly worship, their angelology, the four living creatures, the 24 elders, that sort of thing. And then, of course, as evangelical Christians, we've all sung many songs that have been developed from these two chapters. The most common now is a Revelation song, which it seems like probably gets sung about every third week in most evangelical Christian churches. So we're pretty familiar with the contents of these two chapters, but there are a lot of details that can be unpacked here. So we'll begin in Revelation 4, verses 1 through 11. I'll let you read that passage yourself in order to save a little time. 4:1 begins with the door of heaven being opened. He says, after these things, the door to heaven was opened. This is two things. The after these things refers to the letters to the seven churches, and the door to heaven is actually a pretty common image in apocalyptic literature. You can see there in your notes a reference back to the Jacob's ladder scene in the book of Genesis, where he sees a gate to heaven, and there are a couple of references to Third Maccabees and First Enoch and that sort of thing in your notes as well. Some writers will, commentators on Revelation, will take these two chapters 4 and 5, and relate them to the present age. So what is happening in Revelation 4 and 5 is happening sort of right now. The Lamb is reigning from heaven, and the judgment has not quite begun yet. Others would say, actually, chapter 1 is where the future material in Revelation begins. Some would say that future material happens actually at the beginning of chapter 6. John says he hears a voice like a trumpet. This is also a common apocalyptic element. You might remember 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 at the last trumpet, when the trumpet, that's the voice of the archangel and the trumpet call of God, and then 1 Corinthians 15 at the last trumpet. Third, there's an angel who calls John up into heaven. So he is taken there in the spirit. And I suggest in the notes this is maybe something like an ecstatic state. He's having a vision. His body remains on the island of Patmos, but his spirit, his mind has been caught up into heaven. Remember, Paul has a similar experience that he mentions in 2 Corinthians, where he's caught up into the third heaven. And then I referenced there 1 Enoch 71, which says, the writer says, my spirit was translated and I ascended into the heavens. And there he sees a number of heavenly images. And so this is sort of stock material that you might find in apocalyptic literature. As John enters this heaven, he sees a fantastic throne, which is similar to Ezekiel chapter 1 through 3. There, the prophet Ezekiel sees a gigantic throne on which something like a man is sitting, and there's an emerald sea and that sort of thing. Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah as well, has a vision at the beginning of his career as a prophet of a gigantic throne in heaven. And then Daniel chapter 7, our Son of Man passage that we've spent some time with already, he sees a Ancient of Days sitting upon a throne in heaven. Throne imagery is very common in Revelation, so here's a couple of Eastern thrones. These are from Turkey, Topkapi Palace, I say that right, where the Sultan's throne was. These are a little bit later, but you'll notice they don't look like thrones that maybe the Queen of England sits on, a personal. They're more like almost like couches. I think my grandmother would have called the one on the right there a settee, something like that. So don't think of this as, because the Lamb is going to come up and sit on the throne with the one who is seated on the throne. So they're more like couches or divans where two or more people could sit on them together. Here's another picture of that same. It does look like my grandma's couch now that I look at that. This fantastic throne imagery is interesting because it's the only place in Revelation, or in the whole Bible, the whole New Testament, where God is described as seated on a throne. Jesus is seated on the right hand of the Father, so you have the implication of a throne, but actually God sitting on a throne is only found in this passage. Typically, thrones are metaphors of sovereignty. He's the king ruling, that's why he's sitting on a throne, or often, pardon me, in the Old Testament, being seated on a throne is an image of judgment. If you remember Daniel chapter 7, the Ancient of Days is seated on his throne. Kind of interesting, and I try to get this language into my talk here, is that John never tells us who's seated on the throne. He always just describes him as the one who is seated on the throne. So this is maybe reflecting that Jewish worldview of not mentioning the name of God. Instead of saying God is seated on the throne, he says the one who should not be mentioned is seated on the throne. So it's possible, my fourth point there, that this throne room image describes the ideal heavenly temple, the thing that was the model for Solomon's temple. And so this throne is less like the thrones that I showed you, and it is actually referring to something like the Ark of the Covenant seated in the Holy of Holies. The throne is described as having a number of different gems, semi-precious stones. There's some jasper, some carnelian. I give you some of the details of that. And then encircling the throne is a rainbow, which the text says resembles emerald. So you can see there in the notes I refer back to Ezekiel, where there's an emerald sea, something, and a rainbow behind it that looked like emerald as well. Some have detected a little flood imagery here with the use of rainbow, but that's not necessarily the case. If light passes through a pure emerald, it would cast a green rainbow. Is there any meaning to the stones on the throne? I'll point you to my blog at this point, where I went into more details. Sometimes commentators will go into great detail trying to find some sort of mystical metaphor behind these different stones. I tend to think they're just supposed to be overwhelmingly beautiful. Around the throne are 24 elders worshiping the one who is on the throne. So these 24 elders are on subordinate thrones. So there's the main throne surrounded by these individual thrones. They're described as being clothed in white. They're called elders. They have crowns of gold. We just don't know who these are. So I've divided this material into two sets of suggestions. Some commentators suggest that these are angelic beings, maybe not archangels, but some sort of powerful angelic being that do nothing but sort of watch what the one seated on the throne does and render worship. Often thrones are used as a metaphor for angels in other New Testament and also apocalyptic literature. You'll notice in the notes I give you some other details of where the elders appear elsewhere in the book of Revelation, and so it's possible these are angelic beings. The other possibility is that these are some sort of human beings, and then this can get divided up at least in four different ways. One is that the elders represent the church. Secondly, the elders could represent Israel, and then maybe to have both there. 12 for the Old Testament and 12 for the New Testament. So 12 represent Israel and 12 represent the saints. Certainly the number 24 is intriguing because it's not the sort of number we're used to encountering, but 12 is. And so we do see 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, that sort of thing. So we'll maybe come back to who the 24 are a little bit later. But one other possibility is that it's a parody of the practice of Domitian, the emperor at the time, who was accompanied by 24 bodyguards who had the Latin title lictor, and they normally accompanied him. So if you were imagining a great king and a great throne, he would be surrounded by his bodyguards, and so you could think of these as the bodyguard of the one who is seated on the throne, maybe his posse or something like that. So like much in Revelation, it's probably best to say we're not quite sure, but it could be any of these four things. It seems, that's what I just say here on point C, it seems best to say that they're elders or they're angels, they're something, and avoid the dogmatism of saying it has to be one or the other. There are also 7 torches before the throne, which John identifies as the 7 spirits of God from chapter 1. And then before the throne is something like a sea of glass. The sky is described as a great expanse. The Lord is seated above this expanse, and there are a number of places, both in the Old Testament and apocalyptic literature, where that language appears. From this heavenly temple, lightning and fire flash out from the throne. Again, you'll see that if you go back to the Ezekiel passage. There's a great deal of fire and lightning and that sort of thing there. And then I give you a couple of different apocalyptic passages that have that same sort of image. So the description of the throne is designed to highlight the fact that John is experiencing a theophany. He is seeing the glory of God. He's seeing the presence of God in some spectacular way. In addition to the 24 elders on the throne, there are 4 living creatures worshiping around the throne. They're in the center as close, so they're sort of, maybe if you want to conceive of this, they're between the 24 elders and the actual throne. Now, this could mean they're just sort of in the immediate vicinity of the throne or between the throne and the elders. I give you some details in the notes on that. These creatures are just strange looking. They're full of eyes all over them, I suppose. And each has a slightly different appearance. I draw the analogy to a couple of different passages in the notes. You can look this up on your own. The many-eyed creatures are actually not uncommon in apocalyptic literature. Often they're described as watchers. They're angels who do nothing but watch what God is doing and render him worship at all times. As I say, they have different types of faces. You can see they have a face of a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle, and all sorts of possible interpretations have been suggested, as you can see that on page 185, for who or what these might refer to, anything from the 4 Gospels to the 4 tribes of Israel to the character of God, and several people have drawn analogies to the Babylonian zodiac. Again, I tend to think, let's not be dogmatic about it, but there are a few things we can know for certain about these creatures. They are the creatures that lead, the angels that lead the worship in heaven. And so like the cherubim in pardon me again, like the cherubim in Ezekiel, they are the guardians of the throne of God. They are the ones who are immediately in front of the throne of God, leading the worship, like the seraphim in Isaiah, like the cherubim in Ezekiel. They're also associated later in the book with the outpouring of judgment on the world. In the next chapter, they are the ones who are going to call out from the throne of God, and the judgments of the seven seals will happen at that point. All of these heavenly persons, whatever we want to call them, angelic beings, whatever they are, all of them worship God. And so in the last half of this chapter, these angels never stop praising God. I make reference in the notes to the belief that Jews believe that angels didn't have knees because they never would sit down. They're always standing before God worshiping, or they're lying before him worshiping. The living creatures worship God as part of a three-part hymn praising God for what he has done. And here you have the holy, 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 drawn from Isaiah chapter 6. They call God the Almighty, which is Ha Pantocrator in Greek. It's a very important term because this is the regular term that would be given to the Roman emperor. So maybe a little bit later I'll show you some inscriptions from Ephesus and other places, Pergamum, that have this title, Pantocrator, but it refers to the Roman emperor. When they've all given thanks, they all fall down on their face to worship. So the four living creatures are leading the 24 elders, and then we'll eventually find out that there's this massive crowd surrounding the throne that all worship God as well. Worshiping the one who is seated on the throne because he is worthy of glory, honor, and power. Why is he worthy of glory, honor, and power? Because he has created all things, and by his will all things exist. And so you're probably very familiar with this from any number of praise and worship songs. So the person on the throne, even though John never actually mentions it, is in fact God, if you want to say God the Father, because in a moment John will introduce the Lion of Judah and the Lamb that was slain. So who is worthy is the cry of chapter 5, 1 through 5. There's a scroll on the throne, and the scroll contains all of the judgments that are going to be rendered on the earth. And there is no one in all of creation that is found who is worthy to open the scroll. So let me make a couple comments on what this scroll is. First, the one on the throne has the scroll, and the scroll is written on both sides. This is actually pretty rare. Scrolls were typically not written on both sides, so I'm not sure there's any meaning to that, and I give you some details about the writing on two sides of a scroll. The scroll has been identified as any number of things. Like anything in Revelation, you can come up with 5 or 6 different possible interpretations. Some people have suggested it's a bill of divorce for Jerusalem. And as the judgment is read, God divorces the Jewish people and destroys Jerusalem. On the other hand, this likely has something to do with the judgments we're about to begin in the Revelation chapter 6. Most scholars take the scroll as having something to do with what follows, eschatological judgments, when the contents of the scroll begin to be read, when the first seal is opened, things happen, and it's possible that as the seals are broken in chapter 6, the opening of the scroll and the reading of the scroll is what happens in chapters 8 and 9. So we'll come back to that in those lectures. So there's several suggested ideas for the contents of the book. Those are all printed in your book for you. I tend to think of it as more of a record of the judgment of God that is about to happen. And then I've mentioned this before in this class, that heavenly books are quite common in apocalyptic literature. Daniel 7, the books were laid out and read. My second point on page 189 is this: when this angelic being asks, is anyone worthy to open the scroll, none is found worthy to open it. This might be surprising that even the one who is seated on the throne, God himself, is not worthy to open the scroll. Probably you might wonder about that, but I think this maybe has the sense of authorized to open the scroll. It's a sealed document, and only the person who is authorized to break the seals is permitted to do so. And God the Father is not the one who is authorized to open the scroll. No one in all of creation. John's reaction is to weep bitterly about this, and the angel stops him and says, look, there is someone who is worthy, and it's the Lion of Judah, because he has triumphed. So here we have, again, this is a popular evangelical praise song these days, but these are two titles for Jesus in this verse, a Lion of Judah, the Root of David. Both are solidly rooted in the Old Testament and also in apocalyptic literature. I give you lots of details there. So as John looks up, he's expecting to see the Lion of Judah, but instead he sees a lamb looking as if it has been sacrificed. And so who is worthy? The Lion of Judah, the Messiah, is worthy because he's overcome, but when he sees the actual Lion of Judah, that Lion of Judah is a lamb that has been slain, a clear reference to the sacrifice of Jesus. The lamb is really unexpected. Earlier in the book, we had a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes, but there's no lamb associated with the Messiah in Judaism. That's not in the Old Testament. Perhaps Isaiah 53, although that was not clearly taken as messianic until much later. Not any lamb imagery in apocalyptic literature, so this is somewhat unexpected. But the idea that the lamb that was slain leads us right back to the book of John. When the book of John opens, the first words from John the Baptist when he sees Jesus is, look, there's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So clearly this is a reference to Jesus, who is worthy to open the 7-sealed scroll. When the Lamb takes the scroll, the elders and the living creatures worship the Lamb as they're all sitting around the throne. The Lamb comes up onto the throne to receive the scroll, and you have a lot of details there in your notes. They sing with harps, bowls of incense. They sing a new song, which again is clearly related to the Old Testament. So this worship of the Lamb continues in verses 11 through 14. John sees this great multitude of angels encircling the throne, all singing this hymn of praise to the Lamb. This worship includes every creature under heaven and on earth, and even under the sea. So here's the 3 categories drawn from creation. Things on the earth, things under the earth, the creeping things, and even the fish of the sea. So the Lamb has been declared to be worthy to open the scroll. Now what remains is for the scroll to be opened at the beginning of chapter 6. That will be the topic of our next lecture.